Court is back in session.
Secretary, please remain standing for the jury.
Everybody be seated. You may proceed, Mr. Trent.
Okay, Mr. Knox, we were talking about the position of the shovel relative to the body. Were you finished with this photograph, or did you have further comment regarding?
No, I think that was it.
This is a closer image of the same in the next photograph. Anything of additional discussion required for this photograph?
No, same.
It appears that this is a shovel in a more sterile environment. What, if anything, did you want to determine based on a closer examination of the shovel here?
Excuse me. Just here you can note, because I actually put a ruler next to it, that the shovel was actually 2 feet 3 inches long.
And what, if any, significance did you attach to that?
Really nothing, because while the length of it could be sufficient for what we saw in the blood spatter, the complete absence of any blood spatter on that would preclude it from being a weapon.
Okay. What, if anything, of relevance did you attach to this close-up of the head of the shovel?
This just shows that there's actually some dried dirt or mud that's on the shovel, but yet there's no blood on the shovel. So again, it's just showing the condition of it in comparison to the amount of blood that's there at the scene.
In the course of your experience, have you had opportunity on cases where soil analysis can be done to exclude or include potential sources of soil deposited at the crime scene?
Yes.
How does that work?
Well, generally what you do is if you had, say, this, you've got some soil on that, you would submit this, and then you would submit soil samples from whatever potential locations where you think that the shovel may have been used. If it's the yard around the house, then you could get some soil samples and submit those. And if you had another location where you think it might have been used, you could also get soil samples from there.
Okay. What are you noting here on the right side of the photograph?
There was a little bit of purplish spatter on the shovel that was consistent with, and it was on the side of the shovel that was closest to where they did the processing with the leucocrystal violet. So it looks like it may have even been a little bit of leucocrystal violet that got on the shovel when they were doing the processing of the other areas.
Okay. And what are you looking at in this photograph?
Just another view that shows it. You can see all these very small purplish spatters right through in that area and around this way.
Okay. Anything else relevant between the comparison of the front and back of the shovel?
There's just photographs showing again the front and back of it, and how we don't really have any significant amounts of blood on there at all.
All right, what are we looking at in this photograph?
There are some saturated areas of blood. I think mentioned that before earlier, and there are also several transferred blood stains in areas on this carpet immediately adjacent to where Brady Peters' body was located.
Again, indicating that she would have been moving around even on top of the carpet over there?
There's obviously some movement in the area. The saturated area would have put her at some point bleeding in this area, and then the transfer stains could be either from her or from another person.
Okay. Back to a shot of the foyer. Anything else to speak of here?
This is just showing the area. So the body's been removed. The chemical processing has not been done yet. And then the subsequent slide shows after the leucocrystal violet was applied. And of course, what you see there is some additional impression evidence. What appears to be hand impression here. Obviously a some type of swipe mark through the blood there, and there were several other impressions that came up.
Now, were you able to identify a number of probable footwear impressions once the leukocristally violent had been applied?
Yes. Excuse me.
And does this photograph depict the location of the probable footwear impressions?
It does, and they're lettered circles. These are my letters, so A, B, C, D, and E, showing areas where there are some probable footwear impressions.
And before we go through those individually, did you compare any of these probable footwear impressions, the shoe impression standards provided by the first responding officers?
Yes.
And were the officers excluded from having deposited these footwear impressions?
Yes, they did not appear to have come from the officers.
Similarly, did you compare these footwear impressions to each other?
Yes.
And were you able to determine whether they were deposited by the same or different sources?
There are different patterns within them indicating, so most likely you're talking about more than one source here, because you have, as we'll see as we go through the close-ups of them, they have differing patterns to them.
Okay. So because we don't have complete footwear impressions for each of these, you can't rule out the possibility that some of them are from the same, but what you're saying is that there's different patterns for each one of these?
There are, and we'll see that in the close-up photographs.
Okay. And based on your experience, what is a different pattern amongst footwear impressions or probable footwear impressions most commonly indicate?
Well, if you have multiple different patterns that are from different types of footwear, then it obviously would mean that you've got more than one type of footwear. So that's most often associated with multiple people. Because obviously, the only other way you have multiple footwear is that somebody has to be changing footwear during the course of what they're doing. So in terms of what's being deposited in the blood, then you'd have different impressions, which would indicate that you have more than one footwear, likely more than one person depositing it.
And just to clarify, Miss Peters wasn't wearing any footwear at all at the time, correct?
That's correct.
Other than her socks, I mean.
Right. She did not have any shoes on.
So would this be what you had marked in the last slide as impression A?
Yes.
Okay. What do you note with respect to this footwear impression?
This is just kind of an orientation photo where it is. If you actually go to the next slide, you'll get a closer view, and you can see the type of patterning to it. So you have some sort of curved patterns in this area. You have some straighter, sort of rectangular patterning in that area.
And were you able to determine whether the part to the right side of the photograph near the ruler there was the heel or toe of the impression?
It can't really tell for certain because there's not enough of the total impression to really see.
Okay. Is this a different impression than the one we were just looking at?
This is B.
Okay.
And of course you can see you have this sort of, not quite linear, but these patterns across like here.
Okay. Is this a farther back picture of B, or is this C we're now looking at?
This is all going to be C coming up here.
All right. Is this a close-up of C then?
Yes.
Okay.
This is a close-up of C, and again, different type of shape to it. There's some curved stuff here, and then you have some almost rectangular-looking portions of it in here.
Okay. Is this the same one, or is this another one?
This is D.
Okay.
And D, again, you have this linear shape through here, and then you have these other portions of sort of almost rectangular extending off of that.
Is this one here E?
Yes, this is
Okay.
E.
And what did you note about this one?
E, again, you have just some different shapes to it. You have some various different lines in it, different geometry to it.
What were you taking note of back from this perspective?
This mainly just, again, gives a little bit different view of so you can see that the shovel is right in here. You can see where she is here, and debris that's on the carpet, knocked over basket, so just a different view of showing what's there.
Okay. In this photograph, you're looking at a gunshot wound to Ms. Peters' right ear, is that correct?
That's correct.
What, if any, significance did you attach to this?
Just showing again what this wound is, that she has a gunshot wound to the right side of the head, and then of course there are a number of different wounds to the head as well. So like subsequent slides will show some of the blunt force.
Some of the different types of injuries sustained?
Yes.
Okay.
So there's multiples, different blunt force impacts to the head. You can see various different wounds, including up here.
What type of a weapon would you expect to have caused those laceration style wounds like that?
I mean, it could be a lot of different things. What you typically see when you're looking at a weapon and trying to compare it to wounds would be any type of shape. So where you have a straight laceration, and particularly where you have straight bone fractures, you're looking for a weapon that has something on it that's straight like that. Sometimes you'll get curved wounds where you have something that a weapon has making an impression that's curved, or various different things like that. So here you have fairly straight lacerations. They're fairly, most of them are fairly short, so it could be really a variety of weapons that have some straight edge to them or some straight portion to them that could cause those.
Is this blunt force trauma still, or is this a perforating or stabbing type wound?
These are apparently from blunt force trauma. There could be some type of perforating or stabbing depending on what you're being struck with. So you could have a weapon that has maybe a sharp edge to it or has a more pointed side to it, and that could create what's more of an incised or impressed type of wound.
Do you have any opinion about the type of weapon or object that would have caused this first wound here that we're talking about?
It really could be a lot of different things. That, like I said, something that's fairly straight. There's not much curvature to any of these, but that really could include a lot of different possible weapons.
Okay. Is this one here that we're looking at a picture of additional gunshot wounds to Ms. Peters?
Right. This is one of the gunshot wounds, and you can see that there's actually a connection between the gunshot wound to the arm and to the chest. That's not uncommon that you'll get because arms can be moved around where a bullet might go through an arm and then into a person's body.
So this is on Ms. Peters' right side, correct?
That's correct.
Is there any reason to think that these wounds here correspond to the blood spatter on the right side of the hall, or what would be the right side of the hall if you were moving from Ms. Peters' bedroom out towards the front door?
That could be associated with the blood spatter that was along the right side of the hall, because the particularly wound to the arm, you would begin to get some blood to the surface fairly quickly. The extremities tend to bleed more than
Are these wounds that we see right there, can you tell whether those are entry versus exit wounds?
that is actually, this is a graze wound. So the bullet basically just crosses the arm this way, and then this is an entry wound.
Okay.
So what tends to be associated, I think, is what's being demonstrated here by the medical examiner in the photograph, is that graze wound can align to this. So a bullet can graze the arm and then go into the chest.
She would have had to have been struck from kind of the front and perhaps to the right in order to have sustained that, correct? In other words, she's not being shot from behind when she sustained this injury?
That'd be correct, yes.
Okay. And this is another photo of the same injury?
Yes.
This is on her left side now. What are you looking at this for in terms of significance to the reconstruction?
This is another gunshot wound, and this one is actually moving in a downward direction. Again, I think the key thing with all these different gunshot wounds in the different directions is just like with the blunt force and with the blood, we don't have statically a bunch of gunshot wounds coming in from the same direction on her body. They're coming from very different directions, which is indicative of that there's relative movement going on between her and the firearm. That can be that the person shooting her is moving around her, that can be that she's moving around them, or what's more likely is that they're both moving because of a struggle, and therefore shots are coming in different directions.
Now with this one, you said it was traveling from up to down, is that correct?
That's right.
So her body would have to be kind of either bent over or on all fours or something to that effect in order to have sustained the shot from that direction?
Right. What you can know is that the firearm had to have been above the wound and firing across this way. So you can tell where the firearm is relative to her body. Now that could be a lot of different possibilities, as you suggested. If she's bent forward and somebody's standing pointing a gun straight at her, then you could get that relative downward positioning. It could be a combination of other things. It could be her in a lower position and somebody standing over her. It could be a person that's just holding a gun up, or some combination of that where maybe she's a little bit lower and leaning forward and the person is shooting down at an angle, and you get that same effect.
Okay. What about this next wound on Ms. Peters' back?
This one is, again, another gunshot wound, and it was actually documented as being an upward shot. So again, we've got shots coming from different directions. Front of her body, you've got one that's going downward. The back of her body, you have one coming upward. So there's a lot of relative movement between her body and the firearm, which could be from a struggle or from something similar happening.
In terms of the direction that this projectile traveled once it had penetrated Ms. Peters' skin, you're saying that it's going up, which in this photograph would be from right to left?
That's correct. It's going basically in this direction like this is the way that it's documented.
Okay. Would that require the same kind of positioning you were just talking about relative to the front left chest area on Ms. Peters? Would she have to be bent over or some other manipulated position in order for the bullet to take that trajectory?
Right, most likely, because obviously if she's standing up, then the person would have to be holding a gun down here and shooting upward, but more likely is that she's not in an upright position at the time, that she's leaned forward or something like that.
Okay. This is another gunshot wound?
Yes.
And what does this one depict?
That's left shoulder, and that one is from front to back, going basically in this direction.
Okay. So that one that projectile actually exited?
I don't think it did. I think that one was actually found inside of her. That this is the entrance wound, but the path of travel will be front to back and slightly left to right relative to her body. So basically like that.
Is that small laceration then down directly kind of below the entrance wound there? Is that just the unrelated laceration?
I don't have a notation to recall if that's. Sometimes you get what's called a slit-like exit, where you get a bullet fragment that exits. It's lined up with that, but I don't have a notation if that's in fact an exit wound or from something unrelated.
Okay.
One thing about this particular gunshot wound is there is powder stippling around the wound, which means the firearm's fairly close to the skin at the time of the shooting.
Within approximately what distance?
You're looking at probably something around 6 to 12 inches, something like that. So the firearm is fairly close. When you talk about powder stippling, when you get past a couple of feet, you stop seeing that. So you're talking about probably fairly close.
Okay. Next injury?
And that's right forearm, another gunshot wound there, which is right to left and upward relative to her body. But again, this you can see the stippling again. So it's another one where the firearm is fairly close to her arm at the time that the firearm was discharged.
Okay. Now this is one of the gruesome impact or strike photos of the injury that was fatal. What, if any, conclusions were you able to draw about this particular injury?
Well, the biggest thing there is, of course, that would have been a very bloodletting injury. By the time that you get to this type of blunt force trauma, that's where you're seeing significant amounts of blood spatter. That would be associated with what happened in the foyer.
So this is going to be one of the last injuries she sustains, if not the last injury.
Yes.
Okay. This circular injury identified underneath her scalp on top of her head. What, if anything, were you able to conclude about this particular wound pattern?
You have what's described as an ovoid fracture, but you can actually see this round pattern to it. So again, when you start looking at a weapon, you're looking at something that would create that type of a round pattern, as opposed to the linear fracture that we saw on the back of her head.
And this may be an obvious point, but I think perhaps it bears mentioning it. The shape of the wound is going to typically correspond to the shape of the object which causes the wound. Is that correct?
That's right. Pattern impression, just like it would be if you struck anything else. And what you see then when you see different shapes like that is that it's either different weapons or different portions of the same weapon that has different shapes to it. But certainly different wounds that have different pattern impressions to them.
What about these lacerations to the left side of Ms. Peters' forehead?
These also have some ovoid shape to them, and if you go to the next slide, you'll see that there's actually depression in the skull, but there's a more rounded shape to it. So whatever is involved here, you have some linear fractures and you have some more rounded or ovoid type fractures. So it's either multiple weapons or it's one weapon that has different surfaces to it that has created that.
And if it's one weapon, based on the cast-off you identified, you would expect that. Is there a particular length you would expect that item to be?
I would say at least a couple of feet,
Okay.
2 to 3 foot type of weapon, but something that's got at least a little bit of length that you can swing it and be able to project that blood that was high up on the walls.
Okay. What about these perforated wounds to the right side of Ms. Peters' forehead?
Again, you have some lacerations to the right side of her head, and they've got sort of a almost a teardrop shape to them. So you'd be looking at, again, some type of weapon that has some type of similar teardrop shape to it. And again, that could mean something different than the other injuries. That could mean one weapon that has different surfaces on it, such that some impacts create one pattern, some impacts create another pattern, but certainly you have different distinct patterns within those injuries.
Is there any particular weapon or object you would suspect of having deposited these injuries right here that we're looking at?
Difficult to say what exactly it would be. There could be different types of things, tools, hammers, things like that could have different shapes to them, but it's a fairly distinctive teardrop shape to those particular injuries, which is, again, different from what is shown on some of the other injuries.
This is kind of a crescent wound shape pattern on top of Ms. Peters' head. What, if any, conclusion did you draw about this injury?
This is kind of more of a curved laceration. You can actually see how it sort of a half moon curved laceration. Again, could potentially be a different portion of a same weapon, one that has a straight portion and has some curved portion to it, and you get a curved laceration on the curved portion and the straight lacerations on the straight portions.
This is another angle of the same wound I think you were discussing earlier. Is that correct?
Yes, that you can see curved laceration here, and of course there's another laceration to the side of the head that's more of sort of that ovoid.
Okay. Now we're looking at the right side of Ms. Peters' face and head. What, if anything, were you able to conclude about the wounds over here?
Again, you just have a variety of different shapes, because if you see these teardrop shaped ones here, you've got one on the cheek that's a different shape. You've got ones on the top of the head that are different shape. So there's not a consistent single weapon surface that's being used here. Again, it could be one or multiples depending on whether it's one weapon that's being turned in different ways, or one or multiple weapons that have different shapes to them.
In your experience, when there's the multiplicity of wound types and patterns as you've described in this particular case, does that, in your experience, more commonly correspond to different weapons or to different surfaces of the same?
Depending somewhat on the nature of them. I mean, certain weapons, like for example, if you have a claw hammer, and you'll see round injuries if it's the ball portion of the hammer, and then you'll see almost gouging type injuries from the claw portion. And those are pretty distinctive, and you can relate that to a specific weapon. Whereas when you start to see lots of different shapes, various different shapes, and, unless you can really relate that to a specific weapon, then it tends to indicate more than one. But you really have to be able to relate that to a particular weapon and say, okay, what could be causing these different shapes? What weapon would have a teardrop shape to it, have some curved surface, and have some straight surface that you could get these different impressions? I mean, clearly, if you separate it into different weapons, you can conceive of those, but that doesn't exclude the possibility of a particular weapon that might have multiple surfaces. But you would, again, at least be considering that that's possible, that it is multiple weapons.
So the wounds themselves, in other words, don't tell the whole story. To come to any kind of conclusion about whether it's multiple weapons or multiple surfaces, you would have to look at other evidence as well, shoe impression evidence, DNA, blood spatter, all those types of things.
That's correct. That's correct.
Moving around to the rear right side of Ms. Peters' head, any other distinct injuries here that are different from those we've discussed?
No, just here you obviously have a large number of lacerations all around the head, and of course those go again toward the fact that the attack in the foyer is quite dynamic, because you hear on her head we have injuries all around her head, not all concentrated on one particular side, which means that either she's being struck from multiple sides of the head, or she's moving about and her head is moving while being struck, and therefore you get injuries on different parts of the head.
Okay. And this is another view of the first injury we looked at, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. This is the back left of Ms. Peters' head. Anything distinctive about that particular injury?
No, again, just showing you that you have these multiple injuries basically all around her head.
Okay. Anything of significance as it relates to Ms. Peters' fingers and thumbs here depicted in these two photographs?
Primarily, the only thing I noted with respect to that had to do with the fact that there were fingernail scrapings, and the fact that the DNA that was found in those fingerprint scrapings.
Well, that's nothing you can opine about.
Right, but there's not any other. What I would be looking at, and what I'm looking at here, is that you're looking for particular injuries to the hands, things like that, defensive wounds. There's really not a lot of that there. So even though there's evidence of struggling, we don't really have a lot of evidence of defensive wounds, other than there are some wounds to the backs of her fingers and such.
Is that what we're looking at in this photograph here?
Yes.
These are more defensive wounds?
Yes.
What, if anything, if we look at the next photograph here, what, if anything, does it indicate to you that, at least on her left hand here, at least one of the acrylic nails has been ripped off, and it appears that there are breaks or fractures to the bones in her fingers there? What, if anything, would that indicate to you?
That is obviously consistent with the blunt force impacts to the hands. So at some point, the hands would have probably been involved in the wounds, defensively protecting the head or something like that. But she actually, I think, has a partial amputation of one of the fingers, and again, some fracturing there.
Is this one of the injuries that you also described as consistent with defensive wounds?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Here again, this is a close-up of her left hand, where we see that the acrylic nail on her left index finger appears to have been broken. Do you take that into account when you're considering how dynamic the struggle is and how hard the victim may have fought against the person or people inflicting the injuries?
Yes, because you would expect fingernail breakage to occur because obviously if she's fighting back, then she's going to be applying pressure. She's grabbing at anything, things like that, being struck in the hands, using her hands to protect herself, things like that.
Okay. Next, we see some wounds on the back of her left wrist and forearm. What, if any, significance did you attribute to those?
Just some various small lacerations and such. Again, could be from defensive, could be from blocking with the hands, things like that.
All right, back to pictures of the house. What, if any, significance did this photograph here have as to your reconstruction?
This one is just showing, it's a kind of a location photograph. You can see the rear door. This is the one with the curtain that had some small amount of blood on it. That's the far end of the hallway. There's the lamp that was on the floor in the hallway, and then this is the hallway bathroom immediately over to the right.
Okay. This photograph, you've got the common bathroom doorknob circled. What, if anything, significant did you determine about that?
There's what I noted with the doorknob is just there wasn't any indications of any blood or significant blood in that area or around the door and things like that.
So I guess this would be a good time to ask this question. Would the individual or individuals involved in inflicting the most serious wounds to Ms. Peters in the foyer of the house, how covered in blood would they have been following the attack?
There would be pretty significant amount of blood. I mean, you saw the various different blood transfers, all the blood spatter that's in there. So a person that had done that would have similar amounts of blood on them, on their hands, on their clothing, on the front of their body, things like that.
Would you expect then that if the person or people who had inflicted those wounds had to open this door, that there would be evidence of blood transfer on the doorknob there?
Assuming that they hadn't cleaned up. So it would at least have to, the person would have to have cleaned up before touching the door to be able to touch the door and handle it and not transfer blood. If you went straight from where she was and then walked over to this door and touched it, that person, I would expect it would transfer at least some amount of blood from them to the door, just even in handling the doorknob. Your hands would be covered in blood.
Was there any indication in your review of the evidence, either that anybody attempted to clean up the crime scene or themselves at this scene?
Nothing that I recall seeing, no.
You have an area on the floor here circled. What, if anything, of significance did you note on the bathroom floor?
That was an area where the crime scene investigators documented a possible shoe impression.
And were you able to compare that shoe impression to the shoe impressions that you identified in the foyer area around Ms. Peters' body?
Yes.
And were you able to determine whether it was from a different source than those?
Again, with sort of the same caveat as before, there's some difference in the pattern to it. So, without excluding the possibility that it could be a different portion of the same shoe as one of the others, but it had different patterning to it.
This is a close-up of that impression?
Yes.
Okay. I guess I should ask this question as well. Did you have an opportunity to compare this impression to the law enforcement shoe impression standards as well?
Yes.
And were you able to determine whether the officers were excluded from having deposited this probable footwear impression?
Yes, that it's not from them.
Okay. Now you've noted a couple of things on this next photograph. What appears to be a blood droplet on the floor of the hall, as well as a swipe mark on the door frame of the bathroom. What, if any, significance did you attribute to those?
Well, there's a swipe mark in this area here, and this blood area right here, you may recall from when we were going through the stuff on the hallway, there was a placard right there, and there was an area of blood that was identified. So that you have some small amounts of blood in this area, but again, not large, significant amounts like you see in the foyer.
And were you able to make any determination about that swipe mark as you're going into the common bathroom?
Just the direction of it actually is toward the bathroom, going into the bathroom.
Okay. And you, of course, didn't do the actual DNA analysis on whose blood that was, correct?
That's correct.
Is this another photograph of the entry to the common bathroom?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
and there's a blood stain here on this carpet in the middle of the room.
Okay. Is this a close-up of the same?
Yes.
Okay. And you indicate that there are swipe marks right there. Are you able to determine directionality of those swipe marks?
It's difficult to do because this isn't actually a close-up photograph. This is just cropped from the other photograph. So to do that, I would really want to have a better close-up photograph of that area.
Okay. What, if anything, relevant about the victim's body positions here did you note?
This mainly just shows, again, that the area where they are in the bathroom, there's some very limited amounts of blood. So we don't have large amounts of blood. There's obviously some in the bathtub itself, but around the area, you have some small areas of blood such as this. You have just fairly small amounts, very different than what you see in the foyer.
Okay. And you had started to indicate that there is a blood transfer mark on the back wall of the bath as well, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Anything of note on the grab bar there?
No, there's really nothing of note other than I think there was some DNA results, but that's not something that I did.
Okay. And then anything regarding Javante Segura of particular note was relevant to your reconstruction?
Just showing where he was, and again, this is, there's sort of a very limited amount of blood around this area.
Okay. Anything from the autopsy photos here that you found particularly relevant to your reconstruction?
There's not, he doesn't really have any injuries that would, have provided for much blood, so that's just something to note, that you wouldn't get much blood from him.
How about with Tamaya? Anything of particular note that was relevant to your reconstruction?
Same thing as with Javante, is that again, there wasn't really any evidence of any real bloodletting injuries.
And then, I guess this one would be Tamaya. Any injuries noted with respect to Ms. Tanaya Peters?
Tamaya obviously has the gunshot wound to the head, so there would be a bloodletting injury, which of course would probably be the explanation for most of the blood that's in the bathtub.
Okay. Does the interpretation of the gunshot wound yield any conclusion?
Similar to her mother, there was stippling present, so that means that the firearm was fairly close, and wound path is right to left and back to front and slightly downward.
All right. Just a few more very, very brief questions here. Regarding the .32 revolver that caused the gunshot wounds to the victims in this case, is that a weapon of significant enough weight or length to have caused first the fatal injury to Ms. Peters, and then the significant cast-off spatter you indicated in the foyer?
The ability to cause the injuries, it would take a lot of strength. The weapon itself wouldn't give you much weight to inflict an injury, as opposed to, say, something that was much heavier. But with respect to the blood spatter, any firearm really would be too short. Any handgun, I should say, would be too short to be able to get all that spatter all up and down the walls and things like that. That would require a longer weapon.
And you already talked about the no determination being made regarding the gunshots themselves as to the individual's left-handedness or right-handedness. Is it also correct that you can't make any determination about which hand the individual or individuals were holding the weapons in when they caused the impact spatter around the victim's body and outside the house?
That's correct. For similar reasons, I mean, I could hold a weapon in my right hand and swing it this way. I could hold it in my left hand and swing it this way. The impact is the same, so you really can't distinguish handedness in blood impacts.
Okay. And in your experience as a homicide detective, did you have opportunity to utilize ever, or did there ever come a time when you utilized UPC codes to develop evidence relative to any of your homicide investigations?
I'm familiar with them being used in cases, yes.
And how does that work, if you could explain that to us?
Well, I've seen cases where we've had, in one case it was a shovel actually, or a label from a shovel, and we're able to go back to the retailer and identify that they in fact had sold 2 of these particular shovels over a period of time, like I think previous 30 days or something like that, and they were able to bring up transactions so they could show video of the transaction taking place, method of payment. So if somebody used a credit card, then you can actually get the credit card number and everything from that transaction to identify an individual.
Thank you. I have no further questions for the witness.
Take a lunch break. Can we persuade y'all to go to lunch? Let's be back ready to go at 1:30. All right. Either side need anything?
Yes, sir.